Good evening. Welcome to tonight's Five Leaves Bookshop online event. And if you've never been in the back office of Five Leaves Bookshop, you are now. We specially tidied it for you coming along tonight. I'm Ross Bradshaw from the bookshop, and tonight's guest is Nadia Ragozhina. She'll be talking about the story of her divided family, which she wrote up in the book Worlds Apart, which has already been on screen, but there is the book itself. So this event is in conjunction with Nottingham Liberal Synagogue. We've organised quite a lot of Jewish events in the past in person rather than online, including an evening of Hebrew poetry, a talk on Lithuanian Jewish fiction, Keith Can-Harris on anti-Semitism, and most recently Michael Rosen launching the book that we've published in Yiddish, We're Going on a Bear Hunt. We published the Yiddish edition. We've published many books over the years, and the one that might be relevant tonight, most relevant tonight, was a big book of translations from Yiddish from the former Soviet Union, Yiddish that was written from 1917 to 1952. And we might mention why the last date is important here, but enough with the adverts. If you want to know more about our events, join our mailing list. Simply email into the bookshop. We organise about 100 a year. So a little housekeeping, a reminder to put comments in the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you want to ask questions, put them in Q&A. If you could separate those out, it would make life a bit easier for us. This event's being recorded, and it will appear in a few days on our YouTube channel, and a lot of people watch our programs afterwards. Turning to Nadia. Nadia was born in Russia to Jewish parents who migrated to London around the turn of the century. She works for the BBC World Service in France 24 as a broadcast journalist. And outside of work, her interests include sustainability and environmental concerns. She will talk for about 25 minutes about the book. There's an old Jewish joke that if two Jews who have never met meet up, and they have 10 minutes to find somebody they both know in common, or something really, really bad happens to them. This works in publishing as well. So within 10 minutes of coming across Nadia, I find out she has friends of the wife of somebody we publish, although that was quite easy because they both work for the BBC World Service. But there's something that's not a joke, which is due to the traumas of Second World War and earlier, emigration, forced separation, the assorted traumas within the Russian Empire, the USSR, and the former Soviet Union. Many families were split asunder, never knowing what happened to other branches of their family. That's not a news story, but what has made things possible is with the internet that sometimes these rifts can be mended, and that is the case here. And Nadia will talk about her divided family that was worlds apart and is now a little more united. Nadia, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, no, that's exactly, I think that's a perfect starting point. They were worlds apart and now they're united, but I will share photos. So just forgive me if I look to the side, I'm trying to bring them up. But I think this is a very good starting point. I will start by showing you, this is the photo on the front cover of the book. These are the two brothers, and they are the ones that became, they went their separate ways and separated their families. So this is Adolphe on the left and Marcus on the right. And Marcus was my great-grandfather. So it is a very, very personal story. This is a story of my family. And I'm really pleased that I can share some of the episodes and tell you how I came to writing this book and how I came to reuniting my family. And I will begin by telling you a little bit about myself. So Marcus was my great-grandfather. My grandmother, his daughter, she is 98 today. She lives here in London. And I grew up in Moscow. So when I was a little girl, she would, she had these photographs that everything starts with these photographs. And me being a child, she would take out these photographs of her cousin. And, at the time I was really too young to to really kind of question things, to understand things. But as I was growing older, I would start asking her questions. These, I'm going to find the photos as I talk to you. So just forgive me for looking away. But this is, for example, one of her cousins. This is her cousin Genya, a photo taken in 1930s. And I didn't really understand much at the time, but I was very interested, who is this woman? She looks so elegant. We were living in post-Soviet Russia. I had never seen photos like these. And it took me a very long time to kind of understand. And I think a lot of it came already once I started researching for this book. But my grandmother didn't know very much of her family. And what she did know, she wasn't prepared to talk about. And there are two reasons for that. One is that she grew up in the Soviet Union. She lived her whole life in the Soviet Union. She was born in 1923. Lenin was still alive. Lenin had 1 year left to live, 1 year left to rule the Soviet Union. And she lived throughout almost the whole duration of the Soviet Union. So over the different decades, she witnessed and lived through all the different stages of repressions and paranoia and what was happening in the country. So for her, talking about the past was really something that, or talking about her life, full stop, was something that she just learned not to do. And here I was in the mid-90s, late 90s, as I was growing up, I was asking her questions. And even though by then it would have been fine for her to tell me, I also realized that she didn't actually know very much. And the reason why she didn't know very much is because most of her family lived in the West, in Switzerland. And it was Marcus's brother Adolphe who had gone over to Switzerland in 1905, and whom the two brothers were never to see each other again. And so eventually contact was lost between them. And because of the political situation in the Soviet Union, my grandmother had to make do with the photos that she had, and couldn't really tell me anything else, because contact between the two brothers was it was extremely dangerous while it was still happening. They corresponded well into the 30s, into the 1930s, and eventually lost touch. But my grandmother had to kind of navigate the world around her and work out what she could say when. And eventually, I think it all caught up with her. And even now, in her late 90s, when I was writing this book over the course of the last, and interviewing her over the course of the last 7-8 years, I could already tell how the memories of what she'd lived through and her father would catch up with her, and she would get confused as to whether she had told me she would forget that she had actually told me some of the kind of more traumatic events. But I think I need to explain a little bit of a background just to kind of put all this in perspective. So Marcus, even though I'll start with Marcus, even though Adolphe actually left Poland first, but the two brothers were growing up in Warsaw. And Adolphe got married. His new wife's sister was already living in Switzerland, and she said, come, there are jobs here, there's stability, something that was definitely lacking for Jews living in Poland. And so off they went. Marcus stayed behind partly to look after their elderly mother, but also because he didn't really know what to do with his life. He was quite an idealistic young man. And it was only after the end of the First World War that he made his move east and joined hundreds of thousands of men, Jewish and not, who were heading towards the big cities of the Russian Empire looking for jobs and prosperity. But he went because he became a communist. He served in the Russian army during the First World War, and he was inspired very much by Bolshevik beliefs. And he decided that he was going to seek his fortune in Moscow. And that's where my grandmother was born. And I got to know this story gradually. I didn't know it when I was growing up, but gradually over the years of interviewing my grandmother and trying to get more and more out of her, and also doing my own research and reading a lot of books, I kind of built this picture of what was happening at the time. But my great-grandfather's downfall came fairly soon after the initial first years of his life in Moscow, Lenin had come up with something that was called the New Economic Policy, which was meant to kickstart the Soviet economy after horrendous years of the civil war. And the idea was to basically people were able to trade. They became entrepreneurs. And my great-grandfather was one of them. He got a stall at a market and he was able to trade fabrics. I mean, it doesn't sound like something particularly subversive or something very, exciting, but it was not a very communist idea in spirit, and it was very controversial at the time, and staunch Bolsheviks were against it, but Lenin was able to push it through. And so a lot of men like my great-grandfather started trading, and some of them became really big businessmen. So it did really revolutionize and really kickstart the economy in that sense. But when after Lenin died, Stalin ruled that the policy was to be abolished, and everyone who had contributed to it was decreed to be an enemy of the people. And that's how the arrests began. And Marcus was among those arrested and sent into exile. In a sense, he was lucky, and I don't want to use this word lightly, but in a sense he was, because unlike some of the bigger entrepreneurs, some of the bigger businessmen who had traded on a bigger scale, or who had their own shops or had employed other people, those were sent to the gulags in Siberia. But Marcus was only sent to Nizhny Novgorod, which is in the huge scale of Russia, is relatively closer. And he was able to live and work there, but he was stripped of all his possessions. He was he was disenfranchised effectively. He lost his right to vote, and he had to leave Moscow and his family behind. And that was the breaking point for him, really, because his world collapsed on itself. He came to Moscow believing communism, believing in this new experiment, and hoping that he was going to have a much better life as a result, which he did for a few short years until everything collapsed. And that was the most transformative moment, I think, for my grandmother as well, because she was only a child when that happened. She remembers having to leave their apartment where they had been living until then, with only her cot that they were allowed to take with them by the authorities, and a big mirror that her mother was using for her work. She was a clothes designer, so she had asked a family friend to rip the mirror out. And that was also very dangerous, obviously, because they were breaking the rules. But those two items were the only things in their possession when they left their apartment and went to live in a new apartment that her mother had been able to arrange for them. And that kind of really marks the rest of my grandmother's life, I think. And that would have been in the late 20s. And then in the 1930s, the situation got worse. But the two families in Moscow and in Switzerland, they still correspond. And so one of the photos that I showed you, and I'm going to try and find the other cousin, those photos are from the 1930s. So the two families were in touch, and photos and letters. I'm assuming that with those photos came letters as well. This is the photo of the other cousin of my grandmother, first cousins. They were the daughters of Adolphe. These photos were arriving, so there was contact, and we assumed that they were communicating via intermediaries, because it would have been extremely dangerous for my family in the Soviet Union to be receiving these letters and postcards, photos from the West. Adolphe, in the meantime, had settled in the Swiss mountains of the Jura. Him and both his wife, Marie, they found jobs in a watch factory as manual laborers. They had their first daughter, Ava, then Genya followed several years later. And Adolphe rose through the ranks of the workshop fairly quickly. He became a manager, and his bosses, his employers, trusted him to travel around the region, setting up new workshops, new ateliers for their business. So he proved to be a very capable, very entrepreneurial man. And within 13 years of arriving in Switzerland, by the end of the First World War, he was already relocating his family to Geneva and starting up on his own. So his fortunes from the beginning started going in a completely different direction. And we obviously don't know how much information was being shared between the two brothers, who had in their childhood been very close. And Marcus I think, felt very deeply their separation, and both Adolphe and Mark both felt very deeply their separation, and particularly Adolphe felt that he couldn't do anything to help his brother. We don't know what happened. You know, the photos arrived, the letters didn't survive. So I'm assuming that some information was coming through. We certainly knew, or we believed that the Swiss family had a watch factory, which we didn't find out for certain until we reconnected with the family. But Adolphe in Geneva was really enjoying, you know, everything was working out really well for him. He was living a good life. He set up his own watch factory. His daughters were growing up. It was the 1920s. More Jewish immigrants were arriving in Geneva as well. They formed the Jewish community, and the family felt that they could stop, you know, they had tried to assimilate at first when they arrived in the Jura area. They didn't really show their Jewishness too much because there was quite a lot of prejudice even then in that area. So when they arrived in Geneva and they felt there was a community around them, they felt they were able to kind of be themselves a bit more. And from that point on, the lives really between the two brothers and their families really start going their different ways. And I suppose for me, what kind of became the trigger point of wanting to find out more about my family is that I was really curious about the photos. I was asking these questions. I wanted to know about the cousins and everything. And because my grandmother and my mother, who grew up in the 60s in the Soviet Union, again, you know, those Soviet kind of years of not wanting to say too much to just in case, that was really unknown for me, because in the 90s when I was growing up, Russia was a very different place. But it was only when I moved to the UK, and even 10 years after I moved to the UK, that I first started looking for the family. By then it had been more than 100 years since Adolphe first left Warsaw, and almost 60 years since there had been no contact between the two branches. But I was convinced that, you know, I was really curious to find out if they were still in Geneva, if they knew about us, if, you know, what was happening to them. And so it was really pure luck. And I know that a lot of people are really into family history, and a lot of people do this research into genealogy. And I'm going to tell you that it only took me an hour. Once I started looking online, it only took me an hour to find them. And I know that is astonishingly good luck. Like it takes years and decades sometimes to trace relatives. But I happened to be on the website, on the same genealogy website where Genya's daughter Ariane, so Adolphe's granddaughter, had already put their family tree, and we happened to be looking. We were already building our own tree on that same website, so it was really lucky. And so when I messaged her, I was really nervous because I had spent, you know, all of us, my grandmother, my mother, myself, we had spent our lives knowing about these relatives. My mother grew up in the 60s. It was a very difficult time in the Soviet Union. There was always shortages of something. And she held this, you know, image close to her heart that she had family in Switzerland, and she was lucky. And she kind of tried to kind of keep herself going, knowing that she had this privilege, even though it really, if anything, it wasn't a good thing to kind of own up to. And so when we messaged Ariane, it was a very tense 24 hours waiting for her to reply. And when she eventually did, it was that first conversation with her that really got me thinking about our families, because the first thing we did, we started trying to catch each other up on what happened. And she started telling me about Adolphe and her grandfather and what had happened to him and what happened to her mother, Genya, and her aunt, Ava, during, you know, there was a whole century to catch up on. And already before we even met, she planted that seed, because she said to me that her aunt Ava had gotten married to a Russian Jewish man who was living in Antwerp in Belgium, and moved to Belgium in the 1930s. And her mother had married another Jewish man from the Russian Empire who had left to go to Palestine, and left with him in the 1930s as well. So already the sisters split and went to different countries, and Adolphe and Marie had stayed in Geneva. So already in my head, I was picturing that, you know, one family was being affected by all these world events that happened in the 20th century in 4 different places. And already I found that really fascinating. And we were really lucky, because by the time we started talking and started planning our first meeting, Ariane's mother, Genya, was still alive. She was 97. And my grandmother at the time was 86. And we knew that we shouldn't waste any time. So we started arranging to meet up. And we took our family, we all went to Geneva to meet them. And I don't know if any of you have done this before, whether you've met any family that you hadn't, you met for the first time that you hadn't met before, or whether, you know, I knew not to assume that we were just going to get on, but it was really important for me. I just felt this connection that I really wanted for us to click and feel like a family. And so it was a really, I think at the beginning it was quite tense. It was a really interesting experience. All these people gathered together speaking 4 different languages, because we'd come from all different countries. Some of them were living in France. We came from the UK into Switzerland. And I think what really helped, and again, I mean, I think there's a lot of luck in this story. I think we were really lucky that my grandmother still speaks German. She learned German as a schoolgirl. She studied German at university. She was being prepared to become she was in university between 1941 and 45. So she was being prepared to be a translator, or military translator of some sort, and then went on to teach German for her whole life. And that was extremely helpful, because when she met her first cousin, she could speak German to her, because Genya was born in German-speaking Switzerland and remembered the language. And in Switzerland, you know, most people speak both. And so that was extremely touching, actually, just witnessing. And I'm going to find the photo of the 2 of them from that first meeting, because it was just a really special moment, knowing that there they are. This is Genya on the left and my grandmother Anna on the right. And it was just really special knowing that when they were little girls, they would send photos of each other, of their families to each other, sent right on the back of the photo card. And they never knew that they would meet eventually one day at the end of their lives. And certainly was for Genya. And it was really, there was one song that actually broke the ice. It's a poem by Heinrich Heine that my grandmother learned when she was a schoolgirl, that she quoted, and I don't speak German, but the poem has the word fairy tale in it. And my grandmother felt that what was happening that day to her, to all of us, was like a fairy tale. And so she quoted that verse to Genya. And Genya knew the song with the same lyrics, and she started singing that song. And that really kind of broke the ice, and it was very emotional, but it kind of really got everyone talking. And I think what we also learned is that what was really striking to us is that when I contacted Ariane for the first time, she didn't actually know about us. And I think that came as a big shock to my grandmother and my mother in particular, because Ariane had to ring her mother, Genya, and ask her, what is this? Like, she knew that Adolphe had a brother, but she didn't actually know anything about his family, or it wasn't really ever talked about after Adolphe passed away in the 50s. And Genya confirmed. And for us, that was really strange, because we'd spent our whole lives talking about them, thinking about them, knowing that they were there, seeking assurances from the fact that they existed. But for them, obviously, it was a very different story. And I think it was maybe a bit difficult. And we don't know, we think that maybe Adolphe felt really guilty that he couldn't do anything to help Marcus. And maybe that's why, eventually he kind of didn't talk about us that much to his daughters, who then, once he was no longer around, didn't have much to say because they didn't have a way to contact us. But I mean, I think it's important, and I've had this conversation with my grandmother as well, is that, it's a good thing that Adolphe didn't try to help. There was nothing he could have done, and he could have endangered his brother further had he tried to contact him in while he was in the you know, first in exile, then back in Moscow, and trying to just survive the years of the war and what followed. And so that kind of started everything off. We became friends. We do feel like we're part of one family now. When I was writing the book, I went back and forth to Geneva, interviewing everyone, trying to get all the stories. And it was really interesting for me because I've always been into history. And when I started learning more about Ava and her life in Belgium under occupation, for example, and Genya lived in Tel Aviv during the Second World War, and it was a completely different experience for her. I mean, you know, Tel Aviv at the time, it wasn't the city that many of you will know today. It was not yet developed into this modern kind of bustling city that it is. It was still being built. So it was a very exotic experience in a way for a European woman to arrive in the Middle East in the 1930s. And when I was, and for me, it was really interesting because when it was once we met Genya, once my grandmother met her family and we started getting to know their stories better, that my grandmother opened up herself, that she started, it was actually that very day that we had the first meeting that we went back to the hotel and she started telling me a lot more than she had ever told before. And I was really struck by that. And I think that she was influenced by Genya's personality. Genya was very, she was a lot of fun. She always held conversations. She was always the heart and soul of any gathering, any room, any party. And that really came across. And that is very different from my grandmother. And Genya told us all the happy memories that she had of living in Tel Aviv, of coming back to Geneva after the war. You know, obviously it was our first meeting. She really prioritized the most kind of interesting. But for my grandmother, that really was really, I think, struck her because she grew up in the Soviet Union, always feeling that her father had made the wrong decision and had made the wrong choice. And there was always this sense of we had drawn the short straw of the Russian branch compared to the Swiss. And I think my grandmother started opening up more to kind of make me and my sister, you know, her grandchildren, see it from her side. But that was really interesting because that when I came to kind of writing this book, it also made me see that I am in a very different position from my mother and my grandmother in the sense that I grew up partly here. You know, I've spent more than half my life here now, and I can see both sides to history in the sense that I studied history in Russia and I studied history here, and I remember all the history books in Russia that only talked about the war starting in 1941, really, and it was all about the Great Patriotic War, and it was all about Stalingrad and Leningrad. And then coming here, I was really surprised to hear that it was all about Dunkirk and it was all about D-Day landings. I don't know why it was VE Day. You know, in Russia, we didn't talk about VE Day. It was just Victory Day on the 9th of May. So I had to really kind of almost recalibrate, relearn my history. But by the time I came to write this book, it was really useful because I felt like I understood both worlds. I could see my grandmother's life, and was really shocked by some of what I learned from interviewing her. But I was also astonished to discover that some of the history that I had learned about in history books or by watching documentaries, learning about the Holocaust, for example, I was really shocked to find that it was my history as well. Through my newfound Swiss family, I could relate to that. I could relate to that through Ava's experience, and I could relate to Tel Aviv being built through Genya's experiences, and the cousins on my generation, my third and cousins in Switzerland. So that was a really interesting experience to kind of find myself in this position, kind of almost straddling both stories. And so that's basically how the book came about. And it took 7 years to write it, just, you know, trying to cross-reference everything, trying to interview everyone. I was also extremely lucky to be able to have access to Ava's diaries. Ava kept a diary most of her life, sometimes writing, you know, with 20 years in hindsight, sometimes writing while things were happening, while she was living through them. And I was really lucky that I was able to to read them, to use them, because Ava's the only person that I haven't met. I wasn't able to meet. And actually it was Genya's daughter Ariane, who was very close to her aunt Ava, who after reading the book, she said to me that she almost felt that Ava came out the most, the most real in the book, because I think I was able to use her diaries and speak with her words effectively. So so that was really special. I am conscious of time. I know I've spoken for my allocated time, and I'm sure everyone's going to have lots of questions. So I'm going to hand back to Ross first for Ross's questions, and then hopefully hear from more of you as well.
Right, thanks, Nadia. Just to repeat, put your questions in the Q&A section, but by all means put things in the chat. But certainly if it's a question or you want Nadia to respond, put it. It doesn't have to be a question as such. Put it in the Q&A, and Nadia will see that, and we can deal with that. I can certainly fill the time, but I'd rather not fill all the time. There were several things that really struck me in the book. One of them was one line where one of the Russian relatives had found herself saying, "I have no relatives living abroad," because it was so dangerous. It was just, she had to say, write that she had no relatives living abroad, which is kind of shocking that people.
Yeah, no, that was my grandmother.
So much at risk for having innocent connections to abroad.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that started in the 30s. It got worse in the 40s after the war. It was very much an anti-Semitic trope. It's the usual, loyalty, anti-Semitism issue where Jews are not trusted with the loyalty to their country. And that's why one of the reasons, I mean, obviously very complex, but one of those issues was with that's why there was an issue with having relatives abroad, not even relatives, any contacts abroad. And something that was allowed. So I talk about a very famous Jewish actor and theatre director, Solomon Michoels, who during the Second World War was allowed to travel abroad to kind of gather support amongst Jewish communities, but others as well, for the Soviet efforts against the Nazis, and that was fine. But as soon as the war was over, Stalin had him murdered because he didn't want this very popular man, very big name in the Jewish world or just in the theatre world. He didn't want this man with all these connections abroad and anyone kind of question, for there to be any doubt about any loyalties. And I think for most, I mean, everyone had to hide if they did have any family or any contacts abroad. They had to be extremely careful. And, for my grandmother, it wasn't an option. She couldn't tell anyone that she had an uncle and cousins abroad. And I didn't know about this letter that you referred to. It basically came as a complete surprise to me. We were going through my grandmother's photographs and discussing everything. It was one of the afternoons I spent with her, and she had this plastic bag full of photos, and I was going through them, and suddenly this letter came out, and I opened it, and it was one of those cover letters, that you would write when you're applying for a job somewhere. And she was fairly young at the time. She outlines her biography. I was born here and there. I went to school. I went to university. I did this and that. And then the last sentence in that letter, quite a bit lower than all the previous paragraphs, it said, "I do not have any relatives abroad." It just stood there on its own. And that really shocked me because, you hear about these things. Obviously, it's in all history books. Everyone writes about it, about all the, the ways people tried to communicate and people who had been murdered and sent to the gulags and exiled and everything. And I knew that this was a major thing for my family, but I just never really expected to have it there, black and white, just written like that. And it was really striking. And I think that's why that's part of the mystery as well, definitely because it wasn't allowed. And that's why I got interested in the 90s, because there was this shroud of mystery surrounding them.
Turning to the other side of the family, that although Switzerland overall was a success for the family, it thrived. not all parts of it did. You refer to Eva as going to Antwerp, where she, where her, well, there's no other way of putting it, where her lover and her husband ended up in great difficulties, and she ended up literally on the road as a refugee traveling around for 6 weeks. And yet these people were Swiss. Could you fill in this part?
Yeah, absolutely. So Eva moved to Antwerp with her husband, who his whole family were diamond traders. He wasn't. He worked for a German silverware company, but they were based in Antwerp. So she went there, and before the war, it was a very fascinating lifestyle. I was fascinated to discover about it from her diaries. But they basically went back and forth between Antwerp up in Geneva as much as she would spend months at a time in Geneva, enjoying the quality of life at her parents, going out with her friends, going on holiday in the Swiss mountains or anywhere she fancied really, and then going back with her husband to Antwerp. And then everything started changing. So Stanis, her husband, was one of the first in the Jewish community in Antwerp actually to lose his job because he worked for a German company. So when the anti-Jewish laws started coming in Germany, they didn't yet affect people in Antwerp, but they already affected him. So he lost his job. But he still, like, neither him nor Adolphe actually really saw never thought it would get really bad. They were hoping that, they didn't think that Hitler would last, that it would get really bad, or what was about to happen. So he kept trying to find work. And it was in 1940 that Eva was in Switzerland, and Stanis kept trying to get her to come back to Antwerp, and he didn't have a job. She didn't really see why they had to live in Antwerp. She didn't like it very much. She didn't get on with his family. So, and she had a daughter. They had a daughter together by then. So, but eventually Eva said, "Okay, fine, I'll go back to Antwerp," and that's when they get caught in this. In this whirlwind of events. When I was reading it in her diaries, I really couldn't believe what I was reading, because we know what happens. We know how Belgium gets occupied. And so they were on the train to Paris. From then they took another train to Brussels, where Stanis met them and said, "We're going on holiday." And so they went to the Belgian seaside, to a town called Depan, which I'd never heard of, but it's only 20 kilometers away from Dunkirk. And so they happened to be on holiday in Depan, near France, when Belgium and the Netherlands get attacked and occupied. And complete chaos ensued. They didn't know what to do. Obviously, at the time, telecommunications were a completely different story. So they're trying to find out what was happening. And they decided to walk to France, because France hadn't been occupied yet. So they walk south, 20 kilometers south. They get to France, and they wait. Eva was also disabled. One of her legs was 7 centimeters shorter than her others. She had a problem with her hip bone, and so it was a big deal for her to walk that long. So they were resting. She was recuperating, waiting to see what would happen. And eventually they reached Dunkirk. And as they reached Dunkirk, that's when British troops and Allied troops are being cornered into Dunkirk. And that's when Churchill gave that order to evacuate using boats of all sizes, all calibers, whatever. And Eva writes about that in her diary, and I found it very interesting, because because she quotes Stanis, her husband, saying that maybe we should consider getting on one of the boats as well and going to London. And she was completely incredulous. She couldn't believe how he would be. He was a dreamer. She couldn't imagine how he would be dreaming in such a moment where they had to save themselves from the bombs that were raining on Dunkirk. And so what happens is that they have to keep walking. They have to walk away from the city that's being bombed, and they basically become refugees overnight. So her and her daughter Anita, who's 5 years old at the time, and Stanis's father, his brother, the brother's family, they're all walking, and eventually they get separated. And Eva and Anita will spend 6 weeks on their own in northern France, trying to get to they were hoping to get to Lyon. That's what Eva and her husband had decided, but they just keep walking. They don't really have a choice, and they think they're walking away from the Germans. What they don't know is that the Germans are already surrounding. They encircled. They were already in France, and so they're actually walking towards them. And eventually they they reach the line of the Nazi troops. And it was, I mean, really, it is quite miraculous that they were able to get back to Brussels, because basically Ava, speaking German to one of the Nazi officers, explained her situation. And she at first said to him, "I want to go to Switzerland." He laughed, that was out of the question, but he was able to send them on her way to Brussels, where she reunited with her husband.
He actually gave her a car. He gave her a lift.
Gave her a car.
As Nazi officer, astonishingly.
It really is astonishing. There's quite a lot of moments when I was reading Ava's diaries, and I was thinking, this is not possible. You will remember, Ross, the other story is when her lover, as you mentioned, her and her lover end up staying in Brussels while everyone else is trying to escape Brussels. This is quite a few years later, once they know that they have to flee, but they can't. And she recounts what happened to them, to her husband and her lover's wife, because they were all friends together. It was all, I honestly, the love affair, it really, I think that was the thing that surprised me the most about how she writes about it. There was so much passion. And at the time when we know what's happening, when anti-Jewish laws just keep coming and coming, there was a new one introduced like almost every week or every 2 weeks. And it was only getting worse and worse when she is living some of the most intense years of her love life. I mean, it really, yeah, it's really strange even talking about that. But it was really quite incredible reading her diaries. But I was also aware, I just have to mention, I was aware that she was writing them to be read, and that particular affair, and there were others, but that particular one really did not help her relationship with her daughter, because her husband didn't survive the war, neither did her lover, but her and her daughter did find their way back to Switzerland. And Ava eventually remarried, and but her daughter found it a lot harder to forgive her mother, and Anita, her daughter, their relationship was strained for the rest of their lives, basically, because Anita couldn't, I mean, she was a child during the war, but as she was growing up and then witnessing kind of her mother's transformation, she found it really hard to accept that her father didn't come back, and her mother kind of, you know, it's hard mother-daughter relationship always. So I'm not going to kind of go into it too much, but I talk about in the book, and it is really quite, it's an extra layer to everything. But the fact that they were Swiss citizens, just to kind of finish on that part of your questions, yes, that didn't really help them, because the Nazis had introduced the J in the passports of everyone, no matter whether you were Swiss or not. And even though Ava and Anita had Swiss passports, Anita was evacuated by the Red Cross, who were taking children out of Belgium. So she was sent back to her grandparents via Basel. And Ava was eventually able to leave because her father, Adolphe, had a contact in the government who was able to get Ava an exit visa. And so even though she had a Swiss passport, she still had to be granted this exit visa to be able to get back into Switzerland. So that didn't help her.
I think that kind of answers one of the questions from Ronnie. How was your family affected by the Holocaust? But Viv has asked, if she understands you correctly, that in Russia, you personally didn't know much about the Holocaust. You weren't taught about the Holocaust there.
Well, I mean, the thing about Russia is, like, I left when I was 14. So at that point, no, I hadn't learned about the Holocaust. But I don't want to say that you don't learn about the Holocaust, because you do. And especially in modern contemporary Russia in the last 20 years has changed enormously. And there is an amazing museum now dedicated to Jewish history and the Holocaust in Moscow, which I haven't yet visited, but I've heard about it, and everyone tells me how amazing it is. So I don't want to say that I hadn't, but that's just because I was on that kind of threshold of history where you kind of learn more things in high school, and I left when I was 14, going almost 15. So that's just part of my experience. But in my family, certainly not. That wasn't part of our history. I think from my grandmother's point of view, there was enough horrors on, you know, that Soviet people had lived through that we kind of concentrated on. And again, you know, because Russia is so huge and there were so many different experiences, everyone has their own story. So this is just my family. Who, if you read the book, you will see that even actual anti-Semitism didn't affect my family as much as other things. Like for my grandmother, the main thing was to keep quiet was the family abroad, and the fact that her father had been an hetman and exiled. That was a much bigger problem than being Jewish, because she was Jewish. You know, she had a Jewish surname. She couldn't hide that. And yes, it did cause problems for many, many people. But I think in her particular case, she just had bigger problems.
There was an interesting book which we were talking about called Soviet and Kosher, which was about Jews under Stalin. Many got on very well, moved into the professions. If Stalin didn't kill you, you kind of got on okay. That's a short version of Soviet and Kosher. And people would meet up. They would have lots of Jewish friends. They would go to cafes together. What you couldn't have is much of a religious life or a cultural life.
Exactly, but that was true for Christians as well. Christianity wasn't allowed either. Judaism wasn't allowed. And I mean, again, I think there are so many different ways of being Jewish. Yeah. And, even now there are so many ways of being Jewish, and everyone is, different in a way. And I think for my grandmother, she knew she was Jewish. Like, her and her best friend used to go to the Jewish theater. They understood the Jewish theater in Yiddish because they spoke German, both of them. And they saw Solomon Mikhails, the actor who I'd mentioned earlier, on stage. And that really, nowadays, it's really rare to find someone who'd actually seen him on stage. So Jewish life existed. The Jewish theater that was eventually closed down became the foundation for, I think it's one of the main Israeli theaters.
Habima, yeah.
Habima, yes, I thought it was Habima, I wasn't sure, yeah. And there were other, there were other people who kept their religion undercover and continued maybe practicing at home or teaching their children some of it. Another thing is that my grandmother's father was a communist. So there's another layer to why she never knew it. Like, she's 98 now, she's never been to a synagogue. And that's not just, obviously because she grew up in the Soviet Union, but also because her father, before she was even born, had decided that he was giving it all up. He kept his Jewish name, but everything else got left behind. He grew up in a Jewish quarter in Warsaw. He had the most Jewish experience of the time that you can imagine, but he turned his back to it and went east seeking his idea of communism and new life and equality for all, etc. So I think it's just, Russia was a huge country and there's so many different experiences. So lots of Jewish people experience things differently as well.
I want to turn to some of the other questions. I'll come back to writing about the book and towards the end. Oh, we are getting towards the end. I will come back to writing about the book. A few bits and pieces. One was, you said that you were the first person in the family who didn't have J in your ID card.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned that Switzerland also had J in the ID cards as well.
Yeah, it wasn't a J in the Russian passport. It was just written out. The nationality was written for everyone, whether you were Russian or whatever ethnicity, not nationality. In Russian, it's called nationality, it's ethnicity. So whatever it was, whether you were Tatar and Mongol or whatever your ethnicity was, Jewish, that was written in. They scrapped it when I was maybe 11 or 12 when they scrapped it, and I was 14 when I was receiving my internal passport. So I didn't have to have it. But yeah, it's a very famous. It's called point number 5 because on some, not on all, but on certain Soviet documents of a certain time, I think it came as point number 5 after your name, surname, patronymic, date of birth, a place of birth, or when whatever order they came in. Number 5 was your ethnicity, and so there's still jokes about ethnicity. People talk about, oh, someone didn't get the job, and is it number 5? What was the problem? And I grew up with that. I was the first one who didn't have it. My mother didn't actually have it either because her father was Russian. My grandmother's second husband was Russian. And so I think that comes down the father's line. That's how they did it. So my mother had Russian written in her passport. And I actually have his name. My Russian grandfather's Ragozhina is a Russian surname. And that's why, because my mother, when she got married to my father, who is also Jewish, she didn't take his Jewish name because having a Russian name was a big advantage. And in the 80s, when I was born, anti-Semitism was kind of getting worse again. So they thought, no, let's, she had a Russian name. Let's give our children a Russian name as well. So that's that's definitely shaped my identity as well, because it, in a sense, defines who I am and reminds me almost daily kind of my story as well, and why I have this Russian surname, which I shouldn't have, strictly speaking. I mean, if you think about that, I mean, I didn't change my name when I got married, but this is a different, like, 21st century thing. But in the old days, how it was done, and there is a very specific reason why my name is what it is, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Oh, by the way, in the book, if lest you are confused, there is a family tree,
Yes,
which might help in arrears if you see that.
Yeah.
Karen, writing from Berlin, actually, what a fascinating story, which seems to flesh out in incredibly personal ways Yuri Zleshkina's personification of Russian Jewish history in the form of three daughters. Do you feel that your story is part of a bigger sweep of the fate of Russian Jews, or do you imagine it as the daughter of this family? Are you an exemplar of Russian Jews?
I don't know if Russian Jews or Polish Jews. I mean, because I wrote specifically about this side of the family, and because it all started in Poland, or just, it's definitely shaped my identity. I saw there was a question about that earlier as well. But it's the line, I think what I mostly identify with is the continuation of a line of really strong women, because I don't know if you've realized or noticed, the book starts with two brothers, but everyone that followed, they were all women. And the book basically talks, after telling the story of the two brothers, it talks about 6 women, their daughters and their granddaughters. And that really struck me, because when I was writing about them, it was remarkable just to know that they got through everything that they got through, whether they were in Switzerland or in Palestine or in Belgium, in Moscow, in Russia. It really is remarkable, because their husbands were not by their side, hardly at all, whether they were in the army, whether they were working, whether they were not there, they had to get on with it. And that really struck me. And it was also while I was writing this book that I had my own children, and I have 2 girls. And that really just puts me, when I see myself, when I see the story, I see myself as a line of these really strong women. I hope that, you know, I can do them proud. But I think maybe that's my personal sweep. Of Russian Jews, you can't I've never felt like I could generalize, because even with all the books that I read, I don't think there's one thing as Russian Jews. You know, there were people of all walks of life, such different experiences, because I never felt like was part of a Russian Jewish community, because when I lived in Russia, there was no such thing. Like, we definitely had Jewish friends, and I knew who was Jewish in my school and who wasn't, but there wasn't this feeling of a community, because we were still in the early mid-90s, where there was still a lot of trauma that our parents and their parents had gone through, that we didn't feel free to do that. And obviously it's all different now, just to kind of put that out there. So I think for me, it's bigger than just like a country. It's just Europe. I don't know. This is a very European story. It spans 4 countries over a century.
I think that probably answers Veronica's question about family.
Sorry, what
heritage.
Exactly was the question? Big impact on me.
How you feel about your family and your heritage?
Yeah, I think that probably is what I would say about it. And just the other thing I would add as well is when I had all these questions about my family, I also had all these same very similar, as many questions about being Jewish, because as you can tell, like, I did grow up with it. I just didn't know what it was. And the way my grandmother always knew that she was Jewish, and that was something that she might be persecuted for, or other people that were persecuted for it. It was a cultural thing more than anything else. For me, growing up, it was also a cultural thing, but no one really ever explained what it was or what it was meant to be, or couldn't answer my questions. So when I saw a menorah on the streets of Moscow, when people were celebrating Hanukkah, I had no idea what it was. And I tried to ask my parents, and they didn't know. And that's partly because their parents had not taught them, because they couldn't, or because they didn't want to, because they themselves also didn't know. And so my kind of learning and trying to find my identity came while I was writing this book. Before that, when I moved to this country, I started asking questions, and I actually went to the university in Nottingham and joined Jewish Society. And that's where I met some of my best friends who were able to kind of take me in and answer most of my questions. And that's where my identity was already shaped. But the book definitely complemented it, because finding Jewish family definitely helped. And because I had already learned what I did at university and through my friends, I felt more connected to them.
I think that You seem to have the ability to answer people's questions before they're making them almost.
Oh, is there another one?
I think that answers Ida's question as well. Turning to the, I think it does. Ida can say something else if not, or she can ask us later. She's a good friend of mine. We're getting close to turning into pumpkin time. So I want to quickly ask Veronica's question. She is doing a PhD in creative writing, writing a novel based on presumably her family history, or family history, she doesn't say it's her. So this is writing the novel is having a profound effect on her. Curious about your process and your writing journey. That'll have to be a fairly quick answer, given her.
Yes, it's intense. I think if it's having an effect on you, I can absolutely see that. It's really intense. And it felt like an honor and a privilege to be able to share all these stories, but also to be told the stories, because everyone was very open. They told me all their stories. At times they got carried away and then backtracked and said, oh, no, you can't put that in. And I feel like I got so much closer to my family as a result. And just to be able to learn that and pass that on to future generations and to other people as well, I think I can absolutely understand that it's having a profound impact on you. I don't know specifically what else I can share about the writing journey. It took many years of corrections, edits, proofing, editing, consulting with historians to make sure everything was right. Also, I think we haven't talked about today, but I just briefly say is the concept of memory is something I thought about a lot, because I don't think memory is reliable fundamentally. I think memory is very flaky. And I obviously trusted what my grandmother and her cousins were telling me, and everyone I interviewed, but I just knew that I had to double check everything. And that's why I did so much reading. And maybe that's why it took me so long. But I just know, even from my own experience or from talking to anyone, just because you remember something that happened even a month ago in a certain way, someone who was in the same room with you won't necessarily remember describe it in the same words. So I was very aware of that. And, talking to someone about events that happened 8 decades earlier, it's perilous. So for me, and also because I'm a journalist, I think facts are important. That's why I did all this cross-referencing and double checking. But that was a big part of my journey.
In fact, you give a very good example of that when Eva's husband was taken by the Nazis. The family story was one thing, and then you discovered that another part of the family, or the truth was, well, ultimately, in a sense, it didn't matter because he was taken, but that how he was taken, there were two entirely different stories.
Absolutely.
How he was taken.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
You start at the introduction of the book, you quote from Proust, remembrance of things past is not necessarily the remembrance of things as they were, which, it's a model.
No, I had to put it out there because
we should all remember that.
No, absolutely. I realized very quickly that you can't, people remember. My grandmother is very factual. She remembers facts. She told me this happened and then that happened and that was really bad. But I struggled to get the emotion out of her. It's partly her personality as well. And then with Genia's daughter, Ariane, she's so emotional that all I was getting was emotion. And then I had to slow her down, or eventually, say, okay, but what year was that in? And then she couldn't remember because everything, merged into one. And then I had to specifically go and look up things that were happening in that year and say, well, do you remember this? Was this talked about? Or was this in the papers or on the radio? Like, is this what you discussed at home? Just to try and connect it a little bit, because with her, it was all just about romance and studies and travel. And, and I had to kind of put it all into some kind of a timeline. So, that was quite interesting, the way people, the way people's personalities affect what they remember as well.
I want to, very conscious of the time, I want to ask you to talk about one more thing, and then I think we have to call it a night. This is an act of courage. It's on page 195 for those who've got the book, where Anna, we're in the Soviet Union, and Anna is saved by Maria Tikhanova from things that she'd said at her work. Could you just explain this rather astonishing act of heroism here?
Absolutely. So my grandmother as I mentioned, she studied German. After the end of the Second World War, she got a job in a factory, with German employees, German staff. So the factory is an interesting story in itself, because it was a Zeiss factory in Germany. And after the end of the war, when Allies divided everything up, the Soviets claimed the factory and brought the workers to the Soviet Union. And as far as they were concerned, they were guests, but effectively they were prisoners of the Soviet state, and they had to just live and work in the Soviet Union. My grandmother didn't know any of this. She was just hired as an interpreter to translate for the workers. With whatever they needed. I mean, obviously she wasn't a technical interpreter, so whatever the jobs they were doing, she wasn't necessarily involved, but just helping them out, navigate the system, you know, get food, everything, and help them with translations. And one day, so she was only about 19 years old, 18, 19 years old at the time. And one day she was called into the office and asked to spy on them. And it's a really emotional account, actually. And I was astonished when I first heard it, because my grandmother said no. And that alone could have, you know, meant jail sentence or anything for her. They wanted her to spy. They wanted her to come back and report on every single thing that the Germans had said. And she refused. And she said she refused because she explained to me that she couldn't allow herself to collaborate with the regime that had brought so much misery, suffering on the people, and who had killed so many people. And she knew that if she said yes to spying on her colleagues, that eventually she'll be spying on her friends and family. And that's why she really insisted. And I think that was extremely brave, because she didn't know how this was going to end. They didn't interrogate her, but they put pressure on her for many days. They basically, she was told to turn up at work. They put her in an office, shut the door, and she was kept there on her own for a whole day before going back home. And then the same thing started again. And she was getting paranoid. She couldn't sleep anymore. She was convinced that people were following her. And eventually she went to her mother for help, who knew through her own line of work as a dress designer, clothes maker. She knew this woman who was in the party committee, party secretary of the district, who had her clothes made by her mother, and who was able to help her. And I think that in itself was an own act of courage for the party woman who helped her as well, because first of all, she didn't need to do that. And also because that could have been seen as subversive for her, you know, it would have been dangerous for her own career. You know, who is this young woman that you're protecting? And I think that's also, just to say, or the kind of the slightly bigger issue, but that was also one of the reasons why I really knew that I needed to write this book, is because I feel that in the West in particular, we talk a lot about Russia, Soviet Union, and the repressions and the persecutions and the paranoia and anti-Semitism and everything, but it's much rarer to actually be able to hear an account of what life was like, daily life was like, and the issues that people had to deal with, or accounts like these of what happened when you were asked to spy, and how do you get out of such a situation in this miraculous scenario that she was able to. Basically, she just lost her job and continued. But I knew that it was important to tell these stories, first of all, to preserve the memory of what my grandmother had gone through, but also just to kind of contribute to the recording of Soviet history, which usually concentrates on kind of more symbolic moments maybe of lives, or more important people, but not necessarily ordinary people who were just trying to live their lives.
What I find really interesting is how many people did what they could. And the character that's always debated is Ilya Ehrenberg. Was he a Satan, or was he a saint? That he was at the top of the Soviet Union under Stalin, and he saved some people, and others he just thought were unsavable, and wrote their death certificates. Anyway,
yeah. I mean, it's never black and white, and I suppose you can't always help everyone, right? Because to be able to help people, you have to be certain that you can continue doing it. And I suppose if you feel that it's too risky, then you can't do it. I don't know. Every situation is different, but I just think, having learned these stories, having written them up, I think it's really obvious what comes through is that it's never black and white. And even for what my parents thought was an idyllic existence for their family in Switzerland, proved anything but when we really got to know their stories, when we got to know the stories of the Holocaust and the escape from Dunkirk, and the the years that Genya spent on her own with her daughter in Tel Aviv during the war while her husband was in the army. So you never really know. And I think that's what I was also trying to, that's why I tried to take a step back and not kind of judge East versus West. You know, each story is a story, each tragedy is a tragedy, no matter, you know, how it fits with the rest of the picture of the world. And like, what was important to me is just to tell their lives and how they were trying to live their lives against, you know, up against the war, up against all the turmoil of the 20th century, and how they had to just protect their families.
Thank you. I think we'll call it tonight. Thank you very much, Nadia. There's a note on the chat about ordering the book should you so wish. It's available in the bookshop, of course, and any other bookshops. What else do I need to say? Thanks to Nottingham Liberal Synagogue for introducing Nadia to us. And this will appear on YouTube in a few days, and we'll be advertising that very publicly. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your questions. Thanks to Simon, our worker in the background somewhere, doing all the technical things and making sure that I don't make really silly mistakes by pressing the wrong button. That's it for tonight. Bye.
Thank you very much for having me.